Welcome to All for the Kingdom, a podcast devoted to faithful expository preaching. Today's message comes from Psalm 2 and is titled, The Enthroned King. From the beginning of history, humanity has rebelled against God's authority. Nations rage, kings take counsel together, and people seek independence from their Creator. Yet Psalm 2 reminds us that God is neither threatened nor surprised. The Father has established King Jesus and His kingdom forever. Jesus Christ reigns, and no earthly power can overturn His sovereign rule. As you listen today, I pray this message will strengthen your confidence in God's sovereignty, encourage you in a world that often seems hostile to Christ, and move you to worship the King who reigns over every nation and every generation. And now, here's the sermon, The Enthroned King.
Take your Bibles that you brought with you this morning and find in them the book of Psalms, and then turn to the second Psalm. We'll be continuing in the Psalms this morning. We were in Psalm 1 last week, and today we are in Psalm 2. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. Then He will speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His fury. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He has said to me, Thou art my son. Today I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as thine inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as thy possession. And thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, lest He become angry, and you perish in the way. For His wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in Him. We're in election season. And any election season and it doesn't matter what party you're for, the basic message of any candidate is, vote for me, and I will fix all your problems. Oftentimes during this time of the year, we begin to consider and look toward government and what it can do and what it can't do. And there tends to be an arrogance in that thinking, in that somehow if we could just get the smartest people together, if we could just pass the right legislation, if we could just get the perfect person in the right office, then we could solve all the problems that humanity has. It's not a new thing. The arrogance of man has led many to think that they are greater than God, could supplant or stand in the place of what God has done. We see that all the way back in Scripture to the Tower of Babel, where men thought they could outbuild, outconstruct the power of God. And we see it through our day as well. Just some quotes from those that you might recognize. Karl Marx once said, "Man is free only if he owes his existence to himself." In other words, put off any obedience to the Lord. Nietzsche said, "If there were gods, who could bear not being a god? Therefore there are no gods." Walt Whitman said, "Oneself I sing, a simple, separate person." John F. Kennedy said, "Man may be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human being." All of that flows from the same sort of idea that the power to change, the power to do, the power to make things happen ultimately rests in the power of man. As David writes Psalm 2, he's not looking to the power of man. He's looking to the power of God. And he's recognizing in this messianic psalm, looking even to King Jesus, that the Lord himself rules and reigns, and everything is under the subjection of his rule. And even though this world wars and fights against the sovereignty of God, the truth of the matter is they may war, but God has already won. And we are to put our trust and our hope in him. I want to divide our psalm today in these areas. Now, there's different ways you can look at it. Well, if you ever read commentary on the psalm, you'll see a lot of talk about the different voices and the different people that speak in the psalm. But the way I want to divide it today is in these ways. Number one, the recognition that the reality of where we are, that the world has been, is, and will until Jesus comes back, warring against God, particularly in the effort to put away. In fact, I'm going to use the phrase, get rid of God. In verses 1, 2, and 3, there's the recognition of where we are. The psalmist says, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed one. And then in verse 3 it says, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. In other words, we want to get rid of any restraint that God has put over us. We want to be free to do what we want to do. I would just simply say to you today, friends, this is nothing new, but it is where we are, that the world hates King Jesus. The world hates King Jesus. The world rebels against the will and the law of God. Charles Spurgeon wrote about this psalm. He said, we have in these first 3 verses a description of the hatred of human nature against the Christ of God. And I use that word on purpose, hates, because it is a passionate work against the law of God. When we live in the context of a broken world, we're not living in a world that tolerates Christianity. We're not in a world that appreciates the Word of God. We live in a world that hates King Jesus and has and is and will until Jesus comes back do all it can do to put off the restraints, the inhibiting things of the law of God in all that it can do. David recognizes that what has been true of the heart of man since the fall of Adam, and that is that the heart of man is to reject the will of God and to destroy and disobey the law of God. And this is not new. We tend to see the wickedness of our day as something unique, and I guess that's true of every generation. We tend to look at what's happening around us and we say, man, it's gotten worse. But the thing about it is, I remember my grandparents talking about how it was getting worse. And now we're talking about how it's getting worse. And I suspect our children's children will say, well, it's getting a whole lot worse. It's a lot better in my grandparents' day. I think that's just from the perspective of where we are. It seems like the wickedness of our day is worse than any other. Now, I don't want to diminish the wickedness of our day. Certainly there can be a case that there is a unique advancement presently, particularly in our nation, but you can point to other places in the world where celebration of things that are contrary to the law of God are taking on new enthusiasm. But the larger point is that because of the sinful heart of man, there is a continual state of rebellion. And so I would say that, and the psalmist recognizes there's a continual state of rebellion in the context of groups of people. So he says in verse 1, where the nations are in an uproar and the people's devising a plan. So the nations and rulers and all the groups of people are in disobedience before the Lord, but also in individuals. He says, and the peoples as well are in an uproar. And I don't think, friends, the hope for us, it can be found in a temporary or a long-term solution in the present. In other words, as long as we live in a world that is broken by sin, we will live in a world that is filled with those who hate King Jesus. This is not going to end by political power, economic power, education power, or anything else. David speaks of the rebellion of man as a constant until the day of God. In verse 8, he says, I will surely give the nations as your inheritance and the very ends of the earth as your possession. So this is going to continue until that day when all is set as it should be. You and I must see the rebellion of the world through the same eyes as David, not through fear, not through defeat, but as a result of a broken world and the actions of ones already defeated. I don't know about you, but sometimes I can become disheartened by the things that are happening around me. I see some of the arguments that are made by intelligent people in intelligent situations that are absolutely foolish. They totally reject the very foundational truths of God's creation, and the world around them celebrates it as something that is inventive and interesting and advancing academics and intellect. And when I hear those things, my heart just breaks in thinking we are in a world that is broken and going headlong into even more brokenness. But when you read Psalm 2, there's a recognition that the world hates Jesus. There's a recognition that we live in a broken world, but there's not a sense of defeat. There's not a sense of dismay. In fact, the perspective of David is that yes, we live in a broken world, but these are the actions of ones already defeated. In other words, the kings and the peoples and the nations that warring against God, they may presently be warring, but the battle and the war has already been won by King Jesus. The world hates King Jesus. They are rebelling against the will and the law of Jesus. And the world actively works to reject God's authority. That's what's happening in verse 3, where it talks about, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. That is the desire of the wicked world. I would just phrase it to you in this way. Their desire is to get rid of God. It's been around for a long time. It'll continue until Jesus comes back. This is at the heart of many of the cultural movements we see around us today. When you read and consider what is happening in the political and cultural movements that celebrate abortion and now celebrate physician-assisted suicide, that is an effort to get rid of God. Who is God to say what life is sacred? Who is God to say when my life will end? And it's an attempt by humanity to control life both in the beginning and in the end. It's an effort to get rid of God. The movement to celebrate homosexuality is in the same vein. Who is God to create human sexuality? Who is God to declare what is right and wrong? We can get rid of that and do what we want. Maybe most dramatic in the current days is the movement toward gender fluidity. And I don't know if you've been paying attention any, but one of the most basic things about humanity is being a boy or a girl. It used to be pretty standard and you didn't really have to consider what it was, but today there's a lot of discussion and smart people talking about how gender is fluid and how you can be a boy today and a girl tomorrow. And if you don't think the world is confused, I was in a meeting not long ago and I was meeting with some folks that are ministering on college campuses. And one of the men said, you need to pray. We're counseling with I want to get this right because I'm going to get confused, a young biological woman who believed that she was gender identity as a male. You with me so far? A girl who thought she was a man, but she liked boys. And so she was presenting herself as a man who was homosexual because she was a girl who thought she was a man who liked boys. Now, folks, that's confusion, is it not? But when we look at that, we ought not to be angry. We ought to be heartbroken. That is someone who is being churned up by a larger culture that is attempting to reject the bonds of God. And one of the ways that our culture is attempting to reject the restrictions of God is, who is God to tell us we are created male and female? We can be whoever we want to. That is what's happening in verse 3. It's what's happening in our day as well. This was present in the political systems of Nazi fascism and communism of Russia and elsewhere as an attempt to create societies that were unbound, unfettered by the righteousness of God. History is full of those who thought that they could finally get rid of God. And you can find it all over the place. But I read a story as I was preparing that I thought was so appropriate. In the late third and early first centuries of the empire of Rome, there was an emperor by the name of Diocletian. He was a great foe of Christianity, and he celebrated the fact that he was putting an end to Christians in the world. He had a medal struck that bore the inscription, "The name of Christianity being extinguished." Diocletian extended the frontier of the empire westward to Spain, where he erected 2 monuments. The first monument read this: Diocletian, having extended the Roman Empire to the east and the west, and for having extinguished the name of Christians who brought the republic to ruin. And on the other monument he wrote, Diocletian, for having everywhere abolished the superstition of Christ, for having extended the worship of the gods. Did you know the irony of Diocletian? Everybody in this room, there's probably very few of you who have ever heard his name. And yet for the God he attempted to put off and to end, you've probably all heard the name of Jesus Christ. Diocletian had not abolished Christianity. And in fact, on the contrary, at the very time he thought he had put an end to the faith, Christianity was growing stronger than ever, and eventually it would triumph even over Caesar's throne. Verse 3 says, the nations, the wicked reality of the world is trying to put off the chains, the fetters, the ropes, the bindings of faith, but that cannot be. In fact, I would just simply say to you, friends, don't be disheartened. David recognizes in verse 1 the results of such rebellion. He says in verse 1, and the people's devising a vain thing. A vain thing means a worthless thing, a labor, literally a labor without benefit. And so the truth of it is the nations may rebel, and the people may plot, and the kings may make their stand, and the rulers may conspire together. But verse 4 says, regardless of all of that, God laughs. And this laughter here is not a laughter because it's funny. This laughter here is because it is ridiculous. People's plot. And the nations conspire, and they try their best to put off God, but they cannot. Wiersbe writes, how does God respond to the threats of men? He laughs. It is the holy voice of derision, for God is greater than man and need not fear the proud attacks of puny kings. God doesn't speak today in judgment. He speaks in grace from the cross, but the day is coming when God will have the last laugh. Both Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 both focus on the differences of the righteous and the wicked. Psalm 1 tells us that the wicked will be blown away. They won't survive judgment. They will not remain in the fellowship of the wicked and the righteous. And Psalm 2 tells us that the wicked will be terrified in the wrath of God. They'll be broken by the rod. They'll be shattered like pottery. They will perish. And here's the point. The point is that no matter the present circumstances or temporary success of the wicked, they have not and will not shake the authority of God. Y'all with me this morning? Because I want you to hear that. The point is this. It doesn't matter what it looks like presently. It doesn't matter if it seems like the wicked are winning. It doesn't matter if what is contrary to the law of God is received as truth in the hallways of academia and public policy today. It doesn't matter if the nations are warring and the peoples are conspiring and the kings are gathering together and they even have a plan in way to put off God. The point is this. It may seem like that there is temporary success and the present circumstances are getting more wicked every day, but they have not, they have never, and they will never shake the authority of God. Number 2. So the present situation is that the world hates King Jesus. But the response of God is he is not threatened. We see that in verses 4, 5, and 6. It says that he who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. And then he will speak to them in his anger and will terrify them in his fury. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I don't know if you've ever been in one of those situations where you were scared. Things were maybe moving out of control, and you didn't know what was going to happen. I've been in a few of those situations, but I have also noticed that when I've been in those kinds of situations, when I look to the person who's in charge and they don't seem to be all that worried, it gives me a tremendous sense of peace. It gives me a tremendous sense of peace. When I was a young boy, a group from our church would go down to Little St. George, and we would camp out for a week and fish and have a good time. And one of the years we were down there, there came up a terrible windstorm, gale strength windstorm, and our tents were being blown over. And all I knew was that our leader, the man that took us down there, was asleep in his tent. And since he wasn't worried, we weren't worried. And we had the best time that night and enjoyed all the wind and all the mess that it was causing. And the next morning we got up and we were repairing everything that was broken, and we were sitting around breakfast, and the man who was in charge said, he said, man, I was terrified last night. And I said, say what? He said, man, I was terrified. He said, in fact, if my tent had blown over one more time, I was calling the Coast Guard to come get us and get us off this island. And I had one of those moments where I thought, man, I had a great night last night, but I should have been terrified as well. If he was scared, I should have been scared. Verse 4 tells us this. You may be scared. You may hear the threats and the movements of this wicked world, and you may be tempted to go, what are we going to do? But look what the Lord is doing. He laughs. He laughs. You see, the will of God will prevail. God is the ruler of all. In verse 6 it says, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Notice this is not dependent on the rulers of this world. This is not dependent on the opinion of the people. Nobody took an opinion poll here. This is not subject to the nation's approval. This is God declaring, therefore God happening. God's will come to be by His decree. He says it will be, therefore it will be. The wicked will be subjected to the authority of Jesus. It often seems like that the wicked rebel with little or no consequence. Many in the entertainment industry today openly mock and ridicule Jesus and anyone who worships Jesus. It's become more and more difficult for Christians to participate in just watching the things that are presented to us as entertainment, not even just in the movies, but now in television, for no other reason because they ridicule the things we love. And just as a side note, friends, now I'm about to ruin a lot of what you watch on television. If you're laughing at things that break the heart of God, you're laughing at the wrong things. So much of what is presented to us as entertainment is certainly entertaining, but it's entertaining at the cost of sneering and scoffing at the righteousness of God. And it seems like Hollywood does it without any consequence. Many in the political arena who used to pretend to court the Christian vote now openly reject any pretense of faith, celebrate things that are absolutely anathema. They celebrate things that are wicked and unholy because there's no longer any political consequence there, and it doesn't seem to be any eternal consequence either. Many in our own community, by word and action, demonstrate that they have no fear of God and His righteousness. And they do things that are openly in a rebellion and opposition to the righteousness of God, and we wonder, where is the consequence for those things? We've said it seems like things are getting worse. The truth is they may get worse still. But do not lose sight of the truth about God's will. The will of God is dependent on the power of God. And the will of God is secured by the sovereignty of God. So God's not dependent upon the things that we see. God's not dependent, at least the bringing about of His will, is not dependent on whether or not we like it or are going to help it. God's will is dependent upon His power and His authority. The will of God will not come to be because we helped it. The will of God will not come to be because we allowed it. The will of God will not come to be because we permitted it. The will of God will not come to be because we desired it. The will of God will not be thwarted because of the wicked stopped it, ignored it, or rejected. The will of God will come to be because simply God declared it. He declared it. That's why He laughs. Make your plans, nations. Gather together in your councils, kings. Conspire all you desire, people. But the will of God comes not independent in any way on the work and power of man. The will of God comes by the declaration of God. And He declares Jesus King. Look with me in verse 2. Second part talks about the kings of the earth take their stand, the rulers take their counsel against the Lord and against, most of your Bibles say, His anointed. Now the word there that is translated anointed is Messiah. And who is the Messiah? It's Jesus. The psalm is pointing us to Jesus. Jesus is the king on Zion. Jesus will receive the nations as an inheritance. Jesus will receive the ends of the earth as his own possession. Jesus will subdue and break the wicked. Jesus will receive the worship and honor. All of creation and all of history are moving toward the exaltation and glory of Jesus. So when we look around and we see the power and might of the rulers of this world, when God sees the world, He sees not the might of the kings and the authorities. He sees the kingdom and the authority of His Son, Jesus. So do not be fearful of the powers of this world. Everyone, the ones who celebrate Him and the ones who scoff Him, the ones who love Him and the ones who hate Him. The Bible is declaring that the will of God is that everyone will bow at the feet of Jesus. Jesus is declared the King, and the nations are His. That's what verse 8 is getting at. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as thine inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as thy possession. And this is both a declaration of the sovereignty of God, and there's a hopeful word here for evangelism. The declaration of the sovereignty of God is because by the declaration of God, the nations are given to Jesus, the earth is given as a possession. In other words, Jesus rules all and Jesus owns all. He rules all and He owns all. That means that when Rome was in power, Jesus was sovereign over Rome. It means that when America is in power, Jesus is sovereign over America. It means Jesus is sovereign over China and Russia, and Switzerland and Zimbabwe and South Africa and wherever else you can point to. Jesus rules all and He owns all. It means He owns all the things. He owns all the places and He owns all the people. He rules all and He owns all. But there's also, I think, a hopeful word here for evangelism. Boyce writes, he says, here is the great missionary challenge of the church. It is for us, the grateful subjects of Jesus' divine kingdom, to make His name known among the nations until every ear shall hear and every knee shall bow. I think verse 8 is looking toward the future to ask of me and I will. That idea, I will do something for you. And our heart must not be like Jonah, desiring the destruction of the wicked, but rather our heart must be like Jesus, desiring that all would be saved. There's a beautiful word here that even though the wicked will be destroyed, and even though the wicked will perish and Jesus will rightly judge, the point is that right now, there's an opportunity to bow at His feet. Right now, there's an opportunity to be at the feet of Jesus and receive His grace, not His wrath. The nations are His. You are His. Either you will bow at His feet and worship now and enter into His presence, or you will bow at His feet and worship at the day of judgment and enter into condemnation. So the Lord's response, God's response to the wickedness of this world is to laugh, to declare His sovereignty, to anoint Jesus as kings and declare all things His. But I want you to see how we are to respond as well. Look at the last part of the psalm, beginning really in verse 10. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Some of your translations may say wisdom. Be wise, kings. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, lest He become angry and you perish in the way. Two things I would say in our response to honor the Lord, it would be this. Number one, that we submit to God. That we submit to God. David gives instruction in verse 10 and verse 11 for kings to worship the Lord with reverence and to rejoice with trembling. This is wise instruction for kings, and I also think this is wise instructions for you and I as well. That we are to submit to the kingship of Jesus. That we're to worship Him and give Him the honor and glory He is due. That we are to rejoice in His presence. That we're to tremble before His power. Listen to me very carefully. You cannot both worship Jesus and rebel against His kingship. You cannot worship Jesus and rebel against His kingship. So you can't come in here, raise your hand and sing the songs and say, I love Jesus and I worship Jesus, and then leave here and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, and a little bit of Sunday morning live in abject rebellion against Him. And so David says, be wise, kings. Submit to Jesus. Submit to His kingship and assert and His power over you. You cannot rejoice in His presence and hide your secret sin. You cannot tremble before His power and reject His sovereignty. You must submit before you can obey. You must submit before you can worship. You must submit before you can rejoice. You must submit before you can honor Jesus. Responding to the authority and sovereignty of God begins with submission. Nobody amens that anymore, do they? You know why? Because the word submission has gotten an ugly rep in our day. We don't want to talk about wives submitting to husbands anymore. We definitely don't want to talk about submitting to spiritual authority within the church anymore. We don't even really want to talk about children submitting to parents anymore. I can't tell you, friends, listen to me, I can't tell you how many conversations I have with Christians who lay out their problems to me, and I see at the very heart of it an unwillingness to submit to the godly authority that God has placed over them. They want to talk about all kinds of problems. And they want all kinds of solutions, but when you use the word that starts with S and ends with amit, they're done. But friends, let me tell you something. Your relationship with Jesus begins and ends with your ability and your willingness to submit to His authority. And listen to me, part of the expression of your submission to Jesus is your submission to the authority that Jesus has placed over you. Responding to the authority and the sovereignty of God begins with submission. Secondly, I want you to see that we are to honor Jesus. Verse 12 instructs us to do homage. Now, that's probably not a word that you use all the time. What does it mean to do homage? The word there literally means to kiss. To kiss Jesus. But now this is not a kiss of affection. This is not a kiss of love in the sense of passion love. This is a kiss of submission or of honor. It is a recognition of authority. Kiss the Son means to do homage to the Son. The kiss is a sign of homage and submission. When Samuel anointed Saul, he kissed the newly made king. This act of homage was a recognition of his royalty. In the way the psalmist desires all the men to recognize the royalty of the Son, you may have seen in some movies or maybe in some other faith traditions when the person in authority comes, the other people come down, they might kiss the ring or something like that. That's a literal way of doing homage. It is a physical sign of submission and a physical sign of recognizing the authority of the one you kiss. And so David says, we are to do homage to the Son. To do homage to Jesus is to bow and worship Him as the rightful King. We've already said we live in a world that wars against Jesus, rejecting His authority, refusing to submit to His command. But in contrast to a warring, wicked world, the righteous bow and kiss Jesus, submitting to His authority and joyfully obeying His command. Now, when I say to you, do homage to Jesus, You might say, well, how am I to kiss Jesus today? And I would simply say you do that by demonstrating day in and day out, public and private, important and insignificant, that you have submitted your life to the authority of Jesus, that He rules over you. If you're a believer in this room today, that salvation experience began with you confessing Jesus as what? As your Lord. If He's your Lord, then you've already confessed Him as ruler over you. So do homage to Jesus and honor Jesus with your obedience. But I want you to see one other thing. And this is the sweet part. You're to obey and submit. You're to do homage. But you're also to enjoy His presence. As in Psalm 1, the blessing of righteousness is being in the presence of God. Psalm 2 ends with a declaration that how blessed are those who will take refuge in Him. How blessed are all who take refuge in Him. Now it's interesting here because there is a tradition that believes that Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 were once considered joined together, one psalm. And in some of the rabbinical teaching, there is teaching that the psalms that were most precious to David are identified by the fact that they began with the word happy or blessed and ended with the word happy or blessed. And that teaching gives some support to the idea that these psalms may at one time been connected. Look at Psalm 1:1. The word begins this way: how blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. And then look at the end of Psalm 2, verse 12. How blessed are all who take refuge in Him. Beginning with blessed, ending with blessed. Some of your translations may use the word happy, beginning with happy and ending with happy. Both of the Psalms 1 and 2 point to the blessedness of being in the presence of God. In Psalm 1, the presence of God comes through being righteous. In Psalm 2, the presence of God comes through submitting to His authority and His kingship. But the result of submitting to His kingship is recognized as something that brings about blessing. It brings about pleasure. It brings about happiness. It is the good thing that we desire, to be in the presence of God. How are you to honor the Lord? You honor Him with submitting to Him. You honor Him by obeying Him, doing homage to Him. And you honor Him by enjoying His presence. Psalm 84 says, for a day in your courts is better than 1,000 outside. I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. You know, the truth of it is that there have been many, many, many important, powerful people who felt like that they were able and capable of moving past the righteousness of God. We certainly look to Rome, and Rome is very famous for their work to extinguish Christians, but it's in our day as well. We've seen that in political systems like communism and fascism, but friends, we even see that in our world today. Do you know there were some theologians not too long ago, about 20 or 30 years ago, writing books declaring God is dead? I've shared with you, I know on Wednesday night, I may have shared with you from this pulpit that there's a pastor in Canada now who is an open and celebrated atheist, saying that you can be a Christian without believing in the existence of God. There are those who are celebrating the fact that it seems like the political and cultural movement is toward an accelerated advancement of secularism, and the hope there is that in the not too distant future, that those of faith will be a distant memory and the claims of the gospel will be well forgotten. Maybe because as Christians, we focus a lot on those early days of the early church. For many of us, Rome sort of encapsulates the imagery of a government trying to extinguish Christianity. Charles Spurgeon, preaching about this very psalm, he quoted some other research that's talked about all the Roman emperors and rulers of the day of those in the early church, and he said these things. He said, on of 30 Roman emperors, governors of provinces, and others in high office, who distinguished themselves by their zeal and bitterness in persecuting the early Christians. One became speedily deranged after some terrible cruelty. One was slain by his own son. One became blind. The eyes of one started out of his head. I think that means they fell out of his head. One was drowned. One was strangled. One died in a miserable capacity. One fell dead in a manner that he wouldn't even speak of. One died of so lonesome a disease that several of his physicians were put to death because they could not abide the stench that filled the room. Two committed suicide, and a third attempted it but had to call for help to finish the work. 5 were assassinated by their own people or servants. 5 others died of the most miserable and excruciating deaths, several of them having an untold complication of diseases, and 8 were killed in battle or after being taken prisoner. And then he goes on and he says, among these was Julian the Apostate. In the days of his prosperity, he is said to have pointed his dagger to heaven, defying the God of the Christians' God, whom he commonly called the Galilean. But when he was wounded in battle and he saw that all was over for him, he gathered up his own clotted blood that was gathering around him, threw it in the air, exclaiming, "Thou hast conquered, O thou Galilean." And then he says this, so it has been throughout history, and so it will be to the end. Here's the point. Destruction comes to those who war against King Jesus. But joy comes to those who enter into his presence in humility and praise. The same word that David proclaimed in Psalm 2 is what I proclaim to you today. Put down your weapons of war. Let go of your fight against the sovereign God. Honor him. Worship him. Submit to his law and his rule, and know his salvation and enter into his presence.
Thank you for listening to All for the Kingdom, a podcast of my preaching ministry. For more sermons, manuscripts, and other resources, visit bensmithsenior.org. That's bensmithsr.org. Thank you again for listening, and until the Lord returns, let us live each moment all for the King and all for the kingdom.